So, tell me about growing up in the Great Depression. That had to, that'll go down in
Well,
American
I
history.
I can remember
Where's your little scotch?
in the cabinet. I can remember grown men coming up to my father and asking him for a nickel or a dime, not for a dollar, a nickel or a dime. You could get a hamburger then for a nickel. I mean, I was spared from the depression. I didn't know what it was, and we had enough food to eat, and we had everything. But as I look back on incidents, I remember things, and now are related to the severity of the depression. There wasn't a lot of social network. There weren't a lot of help for real poor people. And I know that above our house, 3 or 4 blocks above there, they would give out some vegetables. I don't know what agency, they would just give it to people. And so people would come up and they'd walk in the alley behind our house. They'd walk up and get these things and then they'd walk back down. And as they'd walk down, they'd be throwing the fruits and vegetables that they didn't like, they'd be throwing them in the alley. I'm sure that it wasn't, Wheeling probably wasn't as bad off as a lot of communities, but it was pretty bad in Wheeling. I remember Wheeling Steel had a big parade through town, and I think it was the time when the wages went to $1 an hour. And these are grown men doing hard work in a steel mill, but that was considered a pretty good thing. Walter Reuther from the United Auto Workers was born in Elm Grove, which was a suburb of Wheeling. So Wheeling was always sort of industrialized and it was always unionized. But I remember when Wheeling Steel, that was considered a really big thing, like $1 an hour.
Jeez.
And haircuts were, I think, a quarter. And when my sisters went to work, I don't know if they made $1 an hour. It wasn't like now. Wages weren't like now. My father spoke in awe of a plumber that was making like $4 or $5 an hour. That was unheard of. That was a phenomenal wage. A phenomenal wage. People used to come and ask my dad for work, and my dad built a garage or would rebuild a wall or do something, because they needed work. And my dad had this one bricklayer, and that day he laid 5,000 bricks. He had 2 men feeding them. And he laid 5,000 bricks. Now the next day he couldn't get out of bed. But, I'd like to see somebody in this day and age lay 5,000 bricks.
Right.
Those men were strong and they worked.
Jeez. So that was from end of 29 through December 7th?
Yeah, it was probably 36, 37.
Do you remember watching the stock market at this time, or was that later with your dad?
Well, I would. My dad told me a funny story. We were here visiting my grandparents. It was Sunday morning, and we walked down East First Street. We sat on a bench in front of Palm School. There used to be Superior Dairies down on East First Street, and then there was a Palm School. It was a school for Hispanics largely. But we were sitting there Sunday morning. My dad's reading the paper, and he reads that 1 or 2 stocks he had went up, and he wanted to go home to sell them because in those days you didn't have the telecommunications you have now. And he was dealing with a small brokerage firm that was out of Pittsburgh. I mean, there wasn't any association with anybody down here. You know, it
So
wasn't
when
like
you
in
say he
Maryland.
wants to go home, you mean go from Austin back to Wheeling?
Wheeling to sell these stocks because he had a little profit. And, well, you know, my mother starts, she didn't want to go home. We start crying. We don't want to go. You know, my mother would get us all stirred up. So my dad, I think he gave up on it. He figured it wasn't going to work. But I'll never forget that. He really wanted to get home to sell those stocks. You know, when the market broke in '29, it then went up for 2 or 3 years. It recovered a little bit, and then it got hit again. You know, it would go up a little bit, and then it would get hit. You know, and the country, no matter what anybody tells you, the country was still in the throes of a depression in 1938 and 39. You know, it was World War II that got us out of the depression, no matter what anybody tells you. I mean, we were in the middle of it, and the unemployment was terrible. But, you know, once World War II began, and they began to draft the men, then the women went to work. The women then got jobs working in these factories. So for the first time, a lot of families had two wages. And that's what lifted the country up. Because when the draft first started, there was a song by Irving Berlin, and I think it was something like $21 a month, once a month. And that's what the first servicemen got. It was like $21, or it was less than $30 for a month of being a soldier.
Your life's
Less
worth
than $30.
Wow.
So, I mean, you can tell, it give you an idea what the wage level was. But, you know, once the war started, then, you know, everything ramped up. Production, making tanks, making planes, making guns, you know. So all of a sudden you had full employment, and you had all of the factories working, all of the women working, and the wages began going up. So that got us out of the depression. And yet, after the war ended, a lot of economists thought we were going to have a depression again. And at the time, Montgomery Ward was the largest retailer in the United States. The head of Montgomery Ward was, I think, a man named Sewell Avery, A-V-E-R-Y. And Sewell Avery believed that there was going to be a depression right after World War II. So he wouldn't expand Montgomery Ward. Whereas Sears, whoever was the head there, thought that there wasn't going to be a depression, and he began expanding the Sears operation. And in no time at all, Sears was larger than Montgomery Ward. So then the board of directors voted out Sewell Avery, and he wouldn't leave. He was an old man. They carried him out on a chair, like 4 policemen, each one taking one leg of a chair, and they carried him out of the Montgomery Ward headquarters. He wouldn't leave. He wouldn't admit he was wrong. I used to go uptown, and at that time, they had a board, and they would mark the stocks with chalk. And they'd have a girl marking, you know, like, there was literally a ticker, a glass enclosed ticker, and the tape would come out. And the girl would maybe tear off 2 feet of tape, and then whatever symbols were there, you know, she would mark them on the board if, you know, if the symbol was on the board. If it was a real remote company or something, she wouldn't. Just the major companies were on that board. And they marked them with pencil, and at the end of the day, they would wash that board, and the next day they'd do it again.
So that's this girl's entire job is to stand there for 6 hours or whatever.
That's right, and mark that board.
Wow. So how often would they update a stock like Ford, something that's...
Well, it's just as often as it came across on a tape. I mean, there was literally a ticker tape. And so, you know, she would tear off maybe 2 feet of the tape, and then she'd go up and, you know, if it was an A, she might have to stand on a little stool to reach it.
Mhm.
You know, because you could only have so many stocks on this board.
So how many times a day do you think they would do it on average? I mean, would it be like,
Oh, well,
4
like an
times a day or
active stock, like
50?
maybe General Motors or U.S. Steel at that time. IBM wasn't anything then. You know, an active stock, that they may have maybe 10 or 15 changes. I don't know.
Mhm.
But some of them, if they didn't trade very much, I mean, in those days, the volume was less than 1 million shares per day. Now we're doing 1 billion. It was less than 1 million.
1 million on the entire market?
Yeah, an ordinary day of trading would be less than 1 million shares traded on the New York Stock Exchange. I'm not talking about the American exchange,
Right.
and there was no NASDAQ.
Right.
You know, the over-the-counter was like the pink sheets. I mean, it was just altogether different.
You know, and Dell
And-
averages now 12.
Well, now they trade 1 billion shares a day. My dad and I once were in New York, and we went to the New York Stock Exchange. And the question my dad asked the representative who was like conducting a tour was, you know, is every trade that comes across the ticker an honest trade? Is it a legitimate trade? Because he wasn't convinced that every trade that came across represented a trade.
Mhm.
And the man said, oh yes, everyone is it's a legitimate trade. So I don't know if my dad was satisfied with that answer or not. But, you know, 1 million was, when they broke 1 million, that many shares, that was a big deal.
What year do you think that was?
Oh, I don't know.
Somewhere in 30s, 40s, somewhere in there?
Oh yeah, it was later than the 30s. It was
Wow.
later than the 30s. I mean, there just wasn't much volume, and you know everything was done. You know, they had to write the orders out. You know, they'd write them out, and then they'd shoot them through a pneumatic tube to somewhere in the office. And then I guess they would, I don't know, telegraph it to their trading desk or what. I don't know how they did it exactly. But then they'd come back with a piece of paper in their hand and say, well, you bought 50 shares of this for such and such a price. I mean, that's the way they did it. And you always would get the delivery of the certificate. You would always get the, I mean, there weren't, I guess unless you were on margin, and you know, I know my dad had his certificates in a bank. And they were beautiful. I mean, it was really beautifully engraved paper. And you know, each one would have a logo. Like a railroad would have a logo of a railroad. A steel mill would have, you know, maybe somebody pouring steel. General Motors, maybe they would have one, or the logo might have been working on a car. And it was really, you know, that's a big collection now, old certificates.
Is that right? You have any left?
Nah, not really. Maybe a couple, but because you know when you'd sell them, you had to give them
Right,
in,
right.
so you wouldn't end up with them unless they went bankrupt.
I know you never bought any of those.
I have a few.
So do you have any memories of like December 7th or shortly thereafter?
December the 7th, 1941. It came across the radio that Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor. So at the time, my father subscribed to the National Geographic, and you know, every once in a while they would put a map in with their volume. So my dad had these, and all of a sudden he comes up with all these maps of the Pacific, and he thumbtacked them on the wall. My mother had a fit, you know, but he kept them up there. He said, "This is where they're fighting." Well, the news over the radio was terrible, you know. Ships were sunk, men were killed. They began ringing the church bells to announce that they were going to have a special service that night, like 7 o'clock in the evening, where we were going to pray, because we were in war and we were in big trouble.
That was on a Sunday, wasn't it?
Sunday, it was Sunday, so it was Sunday evening, and I'll never forget. The pastor was Father Alban, A-L-B-A-N. He was a German. He had a long beard. And the church was packed. I don't know if I ever saw that many people in St. Augustine. It was a big church. Church was packed. Everyone expected Father Alban to get up and start praying. He got up and he bawled out everybody. It was the last thing anyone ever expected to hear. He said, "You're all here. You're all afraid. You're praying." He said, "Why weren't you here last week? Why weren't you here last month? Why weren't you here last year when we would have evening rosary?" Saturday evening there would be a rosary because I was an altar boy and a lot of times I would serve that. He'd say, you know, we would have the services in the evening. There would be 20 people in church, 30 people, and now there's 200 or 300. You know, I mean, and it was true.
Sure.
People were scared. So, you know, they began the draft right away, and a lot of boys I knew, I mean, there was a rumor that if you got married, they wouldn't draft you. So a lot of them married the girls I knew. You know, I mean, they were older than I am, but I mean, they knew each other. You know, we grew up together. So a lot of them got married, but you know, that didn't change anything. They still had to go and have a draft. But you know, all those marriages worked out pretty well. But we had about 10 or 12 boys who were killed in that war, and a lot of them got killed right away. And I knew most of them. I was related to a couple of them. I mean, in the beginning of the war, especially in the Pacific, man, they were all killed. Almost everybody. Japan just went through the Pacific. You know, we didn't fight in Europe as fast. We didn't invade Europe. That, you know, until years later. So in Europe, you know, they were flying missions from England into Europe. But those were a few planes. They'd shoot planes down. But it wasn't like the people on the ships in the Pacific and the people in the Philippines and places like that. There were a lot of casualties then. It was terrible. You know, people would get a telegram, you know. The War Department regrets to inform you that your son, Mike Jallad, has been killed. I mean, and I think at the time, the National Service Life Insurance paid $10,000. That was the life insurance policy. And there were a lot of fatalities, a lot of sadness.
Were you ever nervous that the war would last long enough for you to get of age?
Well, I missed it by a couple of years, but I mean, if it would have lasted a little bit longer, I guess I would have had to go too. I mean, it just the way it was. I was a little bit younger, but it was bad.
You think of all those families that they sort of wiped out, right? So the people that are, you know, 5 years older than you or
Yeah.
whatever, you know, that their whole offspring.
I mean, my best
Lineage.
friend, Jerry Sassine, lived a half a block from me. His brother was a pilot in the Navy off of carriers, and he got shot down, you know, somewhere in the Pacific in a dogfight. And Mikey Jallad, his family was renting a small apartment from my dad. He was in the Navy. He was killed. I mean, these are kids I grew up and played ball with and everything. You know, there were quite a few of them. Right next door, the family that lived right next door to us, they had a son that was killed, Louis Maroon. There were a lot of casualties. It was a tough time. They would have an aluminum drive, you know, and they would ask all of the families to donate aluminum pots and pans because there was a scarcity of aluminum. So, you know, everybody would, they'd go through, you know, my dad, my mother, to start looking, we can give this, we can give that, and they would come by with the truck, and, you know, the truck would get loaded with just aluminum pots and pans. It was a very patriotic war. It wasn't like now, you know. People weren't criticizing the president. I mean, like now they criticize Bush for everything he does. I mean, they didn't criticize Roosevelt.
So why do you think that is? I mean, do you think that people in America has just sort of changed?
Well, I think Americans felt like the war in the Pacific, we didn't choose that when it happened to us. And then, I'm not sure we needed to have fought the war in Europe, but Roosevelt was of an English background, and I think that he knew that England couldn't survive. And so I think he wanted to get us into war. Joseph Kennedy, who was the ambassador to the court of St. James, he was 100% against us getting into that war. So was Lindbergh. I mean, there were a lot of people even in Congress who didn't want us to get into the war in Germany. And I think Hitler, in his own way, said, look, you know, stay out of this. You can take North and South America, whatever you want, you know. But stay out of this. We're not fighting you. But we kept sending ships to England under Lend-Lease to resupply England, and Germany was kept sinking them. Because it was in Germany's interest not to have those ships reach England, because they were armaments. England, you know, England suffered a terrible defeat at Dunkirk, and really England was out. If Hitler would have invaded right behind Dunkirk, I don't think England would have had anybody even to fight. But for whatever the reason, the German army stopped there, and they didn't invade. So then it gave England breathing space, breathing time, and then Roosevelt began shipping them. You know, no matter how many ships they sunk, they just kept sending more ships. So we resupplied England, and then, you know, we began sending it planes. The planes began bombing Germany, and so it, you know, the war turned a little bit on that. But you know, people were patriotic, and when Roosevelt died and Truman took over, you know, I mean, nobody knew who Truman was hardly. He was a junior senator from Missouri. I mean, he was a good senator, but I mean, he wasn't well known. He wasn't real popular or anything. And people were crying in the streets, the world's going to end, Roosevelt is dead. Because Roosevelt had been president over 12 years. You know, for a lot of us never knew any other president but Roosevelt. It wasn't a good time. After the war ended, I remember a lot of people thinking that we were going to get a depression. I know some of them said, you know, if the economy would just hold up for a year or two, that I can pay off some of my debts, I think I'll be all right. And it was just the opposite. After the war, there was this boom because you had this pent-up demand. You couldn't get anything during the war. You couldn't get cars, couldn't get appliances. You know, women couldn't get hosiery. You couldn't get, you know, nylons. You know, you just couldn't get it. Everything was for the war effort. So, you know, after the war, or during the war, most of the people saved their money because there wasn't much to buy. There just wasn't much to buy. So you saved your money, and then when the boys came home, the boys that had been in Europe, they pretty much got their whole paycheck a lot of times when they got back to this country, because if they were in fighting, they couldn't spend it either.
Sure.
So, you know, they had cash, and then their wives or girlfriends, sweethearts, were working. They had money. So all of a sudden you had this tremendous demand, and that's where this Levittown, you know, Long Island, I think it is. Well, they took a chance, began building a few homes. They sold them immediately, and then immediately they realized that you had all these soldiers coming home. A lot of them were married, a lot of them wanted to get married, and there was a tremendous demand for housing. So you had everything, construction, you know, steel, concrete, paving, plumbing. And so, you know, instead of being a depression, it was pretty good business-wise. But nobody really knew it. You know, even the people who played the stock market, they were always looking behind their shoulders thinking, we're going to get another break like 1929. It was, you know, a certain number of people would keep predicting it. You know, it's right around the corner. You know, and if somebody just closed their eyes and bought them all, they'd have made a lot of money. But, you know, there was always that concern.